Perfect. We're all live now. I now invite the first speaker, Side Affirmative, to open today's debate.
Everyone saw the harm of a supply-side shock when a global pandemic significantly increased the production costs of basically all of the goods moving throughout the world. 3 things for you in this speech. First of all, on setup, what we're going to prove to you today. Second of all, on how resilience significantly reduces the harms of supply-side shocks, and then thirdly, on weighing and impacting. Why are these supply-side shocks so harmful, and why is it so much worse on their side? First of all, our path to victory is to prove that supply-side shocks are the most harmful thing which could happen in this debate, and that without resilience and planning, you are never able to weather them to a sufficient degree, while minimizing the potential benefits which they could bring from efficiency. First of all, what do we think it is likely to look like? We think that it will look like things like reserves for oil, which is used in the production and manufacturing, and also the use of vehicles. It's like stockpiles of technology and the resources required to produce technology. And third of all, things like grain, which need to be used for the production of the use of farming, right? And we think that these reserves are used so that they can be drawn upon when you're no longer able to import them at the same prices or even import them full stop. Second of all, we think that you are likely to invest in your own local alternatives to different industries. This looks like developing a local New Zealand industry which can manufacture things like grain collection technology, or things like the technology required to milk cows, which we probably need to import from better manufacturing countries like Japan and South Korea. Second of all, we think it looks like just making these prioritizing the purchase of locally produced goods, right? So we're probably more likely to buy locally produced New Zealand technology in our world, but because of incentives created by the government, like tax breaks and funding, rather than buying overseas. Thirdly, you're going to prevent enemies or people who could produce other things like China from gaining access to specifically New Zealand technology and advancements, right? For example, if we were to develop a very efficient way of breeding cows so that they're able to, or a specifically efficient strain of cows for producing milk, we probably wouldn't share that with other people, because then they'd be directly competing with us in those sectors at better prices, and we wouldn't be able to leverage that technology against countries which might have better scale of economy. Before I move on to the harms of their case, I'll take a POI.
So do you think that in all cases the cost of manufacturing New Zealand goods outweighs the benefits of importing better goods from overseas?
Well, we think it significantly outweighs it when there's a supply side shock, which is what I'm about to talk about. Second of all, know what's likely on their side of the house, right? They are buying the most efficient goods or primary production things, right? That looks like buying technology from where it's cheapest, like South Korea or Japan. That looks like buying oil from Saudi Arabia. This means production is likely to be in a silo or a specific area. So if there is a supply side shock in one place, that significantly harms New Zealand supply lines, because it will take a lot of time to re-establish communication with the countries which we would need to get from otherwise, or because that is one of the significant producers in the world, right? Like Saudi Arabia is one of the 3 biggest producers of oil. If they decide to withhold their oil reserves, there is basically no alternative for getting that cheap fuel. At the end of this, it is quite clear that by using resilience-based economic policy is an effective way to maintain the economy of a country through a potential economic shock. What then are the harms? Take a look at their side. In their world, the government is broadly unprepared for an economic shock. This is because they do not have the reserves, the domestic industries, and the domestic industries and development that we have talked about. The result of this is that when a sudden supply-side shock does happen, what occurs? The price of goods increases. When the price of goods increases, it costs more to do everything, therefore you need to make cuts. This means that you're likely to lose jobs, for example, in the dairy industry, when it costs more to buy the equipment that you need to run your dairy farm, or it looks like you're going to lose jobs at every point of the production line, simply because it costs a lot more to do these things. Second of all, We think that a lot of these costs are going to be carried over to people in the country. This is because now you have to switch to importing from goods from other less optimal places rather than using your own your own domestic industries. This will cost a lot more because these overseas places will be necessarily less efficient than the place you're importing from otherwise. Therefore, it will cost a lot more for people. And we think, note, this is uniquely harmful because people don't have an ability to prepare for a supply side shock. You don't know when a natural disaster is going to happen. You don't know when a war or a significant change in the way that governments are operating their industries is going to happen. Therefore, as an individual, you are unable to save or budget or prepare for the potential increase of costs for personal goods. Let's look at the comparative then. First of all, we think that we're probably going to have better employment during these times of difficulty because we have more resilient national industries which can draw on the reserves which we have until we are able to re-establish supply lines, or secondly, because we have a more insulated economy, which is already just buying more things from within the country, so we stay at a stable rate of cost and inflation, right? Second of all, it means that our exports are more secure because less countries are able to compete with us because we've maintained the advantages and edges that we do have in the production of things like dairy or anything or other goods, right? This means that even though some countries might be less willing to import as much as they wanted to otherwise, for example, if there is an increase in the cost of living in China and less people want to buy milk, they're still going to want to buy milk from us because we're the most efficient place to get that. So not only are we improving the domestic well-being, right, by having more people who have jobs, but we're also improving our ability to export things into the future by maintaining competitiveness. Finally then, why is it so important that people in countries actually have jobs? We think, and it's just important that someone has a job because if you don't have a job, you either have to go on government benefits. If that happens in a supply side shock, it's likely lots of people are going on government benefits, so that will overwhelm the government. They have a certain amount budgeted for that. Or people just don't have access to these things to compensate for it. They're living on their savings that only last for a limited amount of time and they're not contributing as much to the economy. So you're stimulating the economy, yes. We think this becomes a death roll because now less people are buying into the economy. Therefore, the economy is less productive. Therefore, the domestic economy has a much harder time restarting. That is a significant harm. So this is not only a short-term thing where you're establishing supply lines, it is also an issue of re-establishing your production. Finally then, why are supply side shocks becoming more likely, making this more imperative? First of all, we think that generally global stability is decreasing, right? We've seen massive conflicts with countries where tensions are rising on the Taiwan Strait. We see the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The countries are just being shown a willingness that they will do things which could disrupt the supply chain for potential ideological reasons. The result of this is that in conflicts, countries are no longer able to produce things as much as they normally would be able to. This competition is also more likely to happen as resources become more scarce. For example, oil wars which could occur as oil becomes more scarce in the Middle East. We saw how Yemen completely destroyed all of its production during the source of civil wars. These wars are devastating. Second of all, natural disasters. Global warming is increasing the rate of weather-based natural disasters. I explained to you why it is likely that all of these places are in silos. So at the point when you acknowledge that natural or even just any natural disaster like an earthquake could significantly disrupt supply, we think that it means that there is a much greater chance that there is a supply side shock. Therefore, you should rate this point very highly because it is very likely that these will occur and they're incredibly harmful when they do.
Thank the speaker for a fine speech, and I invite the speakers side again open their team case.
We think that ultimately when you have the opportunity to take your economic advantage over another country and ensure that you can make your prices as competitive as they can be to gain an economic advantage overall, we ought to pursue that advantage so that our economy can be as strong as possible. A few things in this speech. Firstly, on setup, what exactly does our case look like? Secondly, dealing with some of the material that we've heard thus far from side F. And then I'm going to go into two substantive points. Firstly, on how domestic opportunities are enhanced, and then secondly, on how our exports become in greater demand. Nathan's going to split on how we get overall greater international relations with other countries and better international economic ties. Firstly then, into sort of the setup and what we support in our case. What do we say this efficiency focus tends to look like? Looks like economic policy that centres on reducing prices and maximising output where there is a comparative advantage to other nations. This looks like our dairy industry, which we could enhance and lower the prices of, making these products cheaper, making the price of these products cheaper for trade partners by lowering the costs within these businesses and also lowering sort of the prices to which we sell goods to these countries. This could look like lowering, offering the mutual lowering of tariffs so that both countries are better off economically, so that we can both have lower prices, both for them and for us, but also by offering things like FTAs and all those sorts of good things so that we get all these economic advantages. What do we say that New Zealand's trading incentives are? It's to ensure that we uphold diplomatic ties with other countries, to maintain some sort of profit incentives of New Zealand business. Ultimately, we tell you that businesses within New Zealand have the overwhelming incentive to make as much money as possible. This means that it's rather counterintuitive towards a business if we're going to tell them not to take advantage of this ability that they have on a global market. Ultimately, the reason why we're so competitive in dairy is because we have such high quality goods. If we did not pursue this, then we wouldn't have such a strong dairy industry. Also, we say that they have the incentive to provide and receive good commodities. This is something that we think is mutual in the sense that when we give other countries good things, we want good things in return. Ultimately, when we're able to do this at such a low price, where it's so beneficial, we're able to even increase our trading partners. Note that New Zealand has a select range of high demand exports like dairy and forestry that we ought to hone in on. Here we are. Our path to victory in this then is proving that we have a stronger New Zealand economy and can lower the prices for the everyday New Zealander. But we also think, before going into some key responses, that we can prove that we're able to deal with these forms, like when we go into these economic shocks, better in the sense that when we make these companies and these businesses more economically independent and more stronger, that means that we have a stronger economy so that we can provide more for ourselves in these times of economic crisis. Right then, into a few responses as to what we've heard thus far. We've been told that costs increase when you have to rely on local industries, like you end up relying on local industries, and that you develop, your sort of tech industries on their side of the house. We tell you this is likely, just pretty unlikely in the sense that New Zealand technologies just aren't very reputable for being very, very good. In the sense that we want to have a good relationship with other countries who are able to provide this for us, not only because it gives us a good look on an international stage and the fact that we have these trading partners overseas, but also because we think that they provide us with a very, very good product, in the sense that when we get our dairy machines and stuff for cows to extract milk from other countries, that means that we start to develop economic ties with them and diplomatic ties, which means that we can be more economically involved. They also told us then that the cost in the dairy sector increases in these times of economic shock, in the sense that trying to get things from other countries is harder because they cost more. We say that ultimately it's going to cost just as much when you try to invest in these local industries, because New Zealand tech just cannot get on that same level, in the sense that these other international companies have been developing these products for so long, in the sense that we're happy to make that trade-off of just entering an international trade with them rather than trying to be independent. We think it's very important to acknowledge that different countries have different strengths, and we ought to play to our strengths and deal with that in our trade relations. Now then, on how domestic opportunities are enhanced under our side when we start to prioritise this focus on economic efficiency. A bit of context here. We say that in New Zealand, many areas of the economy are currently dominated by a small number of actors, and overseas competitors are barred from entry. A few mechanisms in this point. Firstly, we say that we seek to increase competition by allowing in overseas companies. We can set up stores and factories. This can be used to provide more jobs and employment opportunities. This means that when we're able to start to engage in better economic ties with other countries and we allow them to come over and start to build up their businesses by giving the incentive by having good ties with these countries, which we're able to do by having lower prices, this ultimately means that we have better relationships with these countries. Businesses are much more likely to come over into our countries to provide jobs for the people. Secondly, there is a greater diversity of goods within the market, so companies have to look to appeal to consumers in new ways, such as lowering prices. This means that your day-to-day Kiwi is able to go out and buy things for cheaper because the prices are more competitive, because there are more businesses within the country. Ultimately, we say that this comes from us having a focus on efficiency. When we don't focus on efficiency, we end up with a much less strong economy when we're not able to engage in these strong forms of economic power. Thirdly, because there is a higher demand within specific industries for New Zealand products, businesses are incentivized to enter the market, resulting in more opportunities to break into the market for small businesses in New Zealand. This means that our prices are lower. This means that because our prices are lower, consumers end up with more excess money to invest into business, to break into the market, because there's a greater diversity of products. The outcomes here is that certain duopolies and monopolies are able to be broken and domestic competition increases, resulting in a lowering of prices, because they do not have this ability to control inelastic prices and make it so people can just control your everyday goods and services. We say that international corporations are able to bring with them more jobs, so employment increases. Barriers to entry in specific industries decreases, so more businesses are able to enter the market and be established. The impacts is why is this so very important? Because ultimately your everyday person cares most about prices at the supermarket and wants things to be cheaper. We give them jobs and we give them cheaper prices. Now then, on how our exports have become in high demand. A bit of context here. We have so many exports. And we think that honing in on our strengths economically is really important. A few mechanisms in this end. Firstly, on economies of scale. As businesses become more efficient, this allows for growth, and growth equates to better economies of scale, and that total costs increase slightly, but output increases dramatically. Dramatically more. For example, your average cost per unit decreases, meaning you can make more profit while charging a lower price, because it may be lower because economies of scale profit is greater, which means it's better for business. This means that your prices, which are offering to other countries, is lower in the sense that they want to choose you because you have lower prices. Secondly, we have and encourage countries to engage in fair trade agreements because we want economic relations with as many as possible. Why are they likely to enter with us? Because we have such cheap prices and they want our goods so much. Thirdly, we beat competitive prices when we have an advantage. In the status quo, some countries are with other trading partners because they have more competitive prices. Under our side, we pursue competitive advantage and beat competitive prices, which means that we get more new trading partners. The benefits here is that more international economic ties, we get more business competition, we get more involvement with other nations, and we get more money. The impact here is we can spend this extra money on subsidy and stuff in the economy when we have times of economic shock. We prove that we're more able to address economic shock, and I'm so proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for what was a fine speech. I now invite the second speaker, side affirmative, to continue Negating's case.
Okay, we love that outro where you've said that spending money on subsidies in the future once the supply side shocks happen is really, really important. And we so agree, because supply side shocks are going to become so much more apparent in society all the time happening. And therefore we need to do the things to prevent the harms of this happening now. So 2 things for you in this speech. The first being what actually happens to prices and the business landscape in New Zealand. The second being this point of some level of diplomatic relationships and the impact on that. So prices, the biggest push from Neg has been that because we will have more competition in the economy, we will drive down prices. Okay, first of all, some clarifications that are necessary for this point. First of all, New Zealand doesn't really have a comparative advantage at anything, right? We are a small country in the middle of nowhere with extremely lazy workers. We cannot produce anything efficiently because we don't have labor productivity, we don't have manufacturing capacity, and we just can't, right? China can produce lamb and dairy, etc., so much more efficiently than we can because we believe in clean green pastures and give them so much space. That's just not efficient, right? So we don't have a comparative advantage that we can be exploiting when we are doing this international trade. So that just doesn't play out, because what happens under an efficiency-oriented economic policy is you take that comparative advantage and you try and make that even better, right? So what we're trying to tell you is that really, in the first place, New Zealand just doesn't really have a comparative advantage in the first place that can be exploited. And so we think that further reducing prices in these sectors is really not going to bring that much benefit at all in terms of trade and in terms of our ability to do things on the global stage. The other thing that happens is this efficiency policy also only really occurs in one sector, right? We focus on one sector of our economy to build and grow and make more competitive, and we think this is the wrong approach to be taking, because say we do have some level of advantage in agriculture. We focus on making agriculture cheaper in New Zealand. That's only going to reduce prices for New Zealanders for agricultural products. It does nothing to reduce prices in all of the other sectors that are really, really important, and we still have to import things from overseas, so their price mechanism just doesn't stand there again. We also think that their point about economies of scale is that because we'll have more competition, we will produce more economies of scale. We think this mechanism just doesn't stand, because economies of scale exist at the point where you can produce at the capacity and at the volume that allows you to significantly reduce costs of production, right? Those are the sorts of things that cannot occur in New Zealand without any level of government investment, because we have such a small domestic market, right? And we have such small industries to start with that there's no way for them to grow without an incentive from the government, right? Because as long as they are competing with international traders, international producers who can produce more efficiently, they are unable to grow because their prices, their products just aren't price competitive, and so they are unable to gain any market share and just will not grow without any government investment, which is what we see with subsidies on our side of the house. The other point here is that they've made this characterization that technology is the only thing that we would be developing on our side of the house. We think this is wrong, because a resilience policy will focus on diversifying our economy into a number of different sectors. So we will be developing our secondary sector also. We will be developing our tertiary sector also. We also think that although New Zealand doesn't have an extremely good tech economy right now because there are bigger players overseas, we are known for our innovation, right? We have such a good level of academic innovation and creativity in this country. We produce so many good ideas that we outsource to the US, to China, to produce our goods, right? So we're outsourcing that talent that we already have for them to make these things, when New Zealand could be reaping the benefits of that innovation if we kept it in the country, right? So we think that what actually happens to this business landscape is that we'll have a larger range of diversified firms in New Zealand. One, what does that do? It produces jobs, right? So many more people will have jobs in these sectors. And the second thing that will happen is that prices, while they might go up a little bit in the short term because of this because we don't have that comparative advantage
Point of
yet.
information.
Under their side of the house, there's no mechanism for prices to ever go down because we will continue operating with this limited capacity, right? So we see on our side of the world, eventually, in the long term, prices will come down as New Zealand reaches capacity to achieve these economies of scale.
Point of information.
Sure.
When you withhold your reserves, that means that you do not sell them. How then do you supply these subsidies if you ultimately have to sell less?
We think that's incorrect characterization because we think holding reserves is more to do with protecting ourselves in the case of a supply side shock from things like food shortages. So we think that's just not relevant again, and we think that our domestic market is big enough for things like tech to handle that in the short term. So where are we at the end of this point? The negating team does not reduce prices, it does not increase competition, they do not achieve economies of scale, right? So on our side of the house, what we do achieve is we achieve decreases in prices in the long term. We have a diversified business landscape that is more able to handle supply side shocks in the long term because we are unreliant on these external providers.
Point of information.
No, thank you. And what my first thing to touch on, which is really, really important, is the fact that these supply side shocks are going to happen so much more often now, right? Conflict will be increasing because of the scarcity of resources. Natural disasters will be increasing because climate change is becoming more prevalent. We have more frequent and more extreme natural disasters. We also have so many political changes overseas, right? There are more unstable governments who are tending towards radicalization. There are sudden tariffs being imposed everywhere, unpredictable decisions by big powers that mean inflation is just increasing all the time. These supply side shocks aren't something that's infrequent anymore. They're happening all the time. So inflation is consistently increasing and there's no mechanism for it to be brought down. The long-term impacts of that are that people will have to be put on welfare systems or just starve. And so there's no mechanism for them to be taken out of that situation because of those such long-term impacts that it will suffer, the economy will suffer in the long term. So on these diplomatic pressures, what actually happens? So we're trying to maintain our diplomatic relationships, right? And their opinion is that if we cut off trade, we're just going to get rid of all diplomatic relationships. But however, what's happening now is when we have reliance on imports from places like China for technology, and we are reliant on exports to China for things like lamb and milk, we don't have the ability to make any independent policy decisions, right? Or speak out against any issues. Suppose China invades Hong Kong or Taiwan, or the Uyghur genocide we want to speak out about, we cannot do any of that because we will lose all of our trade that our economy is reliant on in China, right? So we must reduce this reliance to regain our position on the international stage as a vocal nation, and so that our domestic market can regain trust in our government that we are actually upholding the values that our government actually believes in, right? Also, increasing our internal economy makes us more relevant on the world stage, which is really, really important for these diplomatic relations also. But at the end of the day, this debate is really about who reduces prices.
I thank the speaker for what was a fine speech, and now invite the second speaker on side negating to come up and continue their team's case.
We think it's wonderful that this debate is about prices and people because we are actually the side that is able to achieve benefits towards people. A few things in this stage. Firstly, dealing with all of their material and setup and what it actually looks like under their side of the house. Secondly, dealing with the international market under that my split. And then lastly, I'm going to be putting those two together and talking about the impacts that we have on people overall. So firstly then on what their model was and what they were explaining to us. Firstly, they said that they were going to stockpile stuff and they were going to invest in local industries. So then we don't prevent massive stockpile
like stoppages in supply. Firstly, I want to flag here, there's a literal reason why New Zealand doesn't have these industries in the first place. Like, we have to trade with Saudi Arabia for oil because we just don't have any oil to begin with. We trade with South Korea and Taiwan for technology because we cannot create technology ourselves. Even if we were to be able to do that currently, or even under their side of the house, the cost of the production of these materials and stuff is going to be far greater than it is just to import it in the first place. Even if you have barriers and stuff, we think that the overall cost, like maybe when there's a big blockage, is just going to equal out. We think that it's far easier to just trade rather than spending lots and lots of money developing a local industry that does not exist within this country, because it just does not. So what does that mean for their big push on that? Firstly, I think that just like mitigates a lot of their like material and the impact that they have there. And what this means is that like all of their impacts and outcomes are just significantly diluted as you go down the line. And that just means that their case loses significant rating power in that respect. But also, no, I think that we have like a case contradiction in their case, because first came out and was like, we are able to like develop and invest in all of these industries. But what did second say? Second was like, oh, we have nothing. We can't do anything. That's why we can't compete on the world stage. Note that they have to pick one of these lines in order to continue their case, because this contradiction means like there is no like massive one line. I'll take a POI actually.
Why does the speaker think that they will be able to actually reduce prices?
I'll be covering that later in my prices split. But firstly, because we introduce more competition by getting rid of and like impeding competition regulation, that means more competition, lower prices, because that's just economics. Okay, so what else under this thing? Firstly, like on their other material about like holding back like technology that we have in this country, couple responses here. Firstly, we think that like if you withhold your technology, you're just seen on the world stage as just like a relatively bad country, and that like no one likes a gatekeeper. People want to share technology around. That's a really beneficial thing, because it actually allows for more cooperation within these countries. Maybe if you trade technology that you have to help another country's industry, they're going to trade one back as a little like favor to like cover up all that good stuff. What I ultimately think we can prove at the end of this point is that like at the end of this with their material and setup is that like we prove that we can actually achieve this more, or like all of their benefits that they want to claim are just significantly mitigated. But now then, moving on to this idea of like resilience to like lots of stuff. What did they tell us here? Firstly, one of their big pushes was like there's lots of global warming and that's really harmful. But no, I want to flag here that this is going to be even more harmful on New Zealand. Take Cyclone Gabriel, for example, that like decimated the Hawke's Bay. What did this mean? Fruit prices around the country skyrocketed. Well, that was extremely harmful. Like a Waddy's tomato sauce went from like being $4 to like $6 per bottle. That cost is extremely insane. That cost is extremely annoying. But also we think that because it is increasing, like they said on their side of the house, we think if New Zealand becomes bashed with lots and lots of negative disasters, that means we damage ourselves more under their side of the house. What else do we hear there? Like we heard that they're going to get like better employment because they create more industries. Note that we think we still get more employment because when we increase competition, that looks like maybe introducing a new supermarket chain into the industry. That creates more jobs, that creates more money. We think we can claim that benefit there. But also they what else do we hear? They said that like economy is going to be like less risk of inflation and all of that stuff. I want to like note that when we can trade internationally and like so I'll move on now to like international trade and all of that. Tyler gave you all of this material at first that still remains largely unresponded to as why we are better on the international market under our side of the house. Why is the international market so important? For example, as I told you before in this speech, like New Zealand does not have very much. We need to grow internationally in order to like be able to supply all of the necessities that we have, that we need to like fulfill and like get into this country. When we do this, we set a precedent on the world stage. Like we're able to bring that all down. We bring prices down because it's just cheaper to import than to create in our local industries, as I told before. But also because because internationally we also have like economies of scale, because as we can grow and become more efficient, that means like as we grow, we become more efficient. That means total cost of production per unit goes down. goes down. That's really beneficial. We create more profit. That means it goes back into these companies that can invest, they improve their products, they sell them for more on the international market. That means they get more money on the international market. What was their big push against this? It was just that like, oh, China creates milk and like lamb as well. That means that's like people are just going to buy from China from now. There is a specific reason people buy from New Zealand, and that is because New Zealand products are renowned for their high quality. Like there's a reason why people don't want to buy lamb from China, because it's like extremely like shady. No one knows where it comes from. But also now I'm just going to do like my split on like how we improve economic and international relations. Firstly, context, what we have to understand at the beginning of this point. Firstly, it's New Zealand uniquely sits in a position where both our diplomatic ties and our economic ties are like really intertwined, and that we need to hold this position. So here's why we get better on both of our sides. Firstly, when New Zealand improves its efficiency in economic policy, implements this economic policy, it sends a signal to international countries that we're ready to trade. We're going to trade for lower prices. That's really beneficial because that opens up doors that maybe we can trade with them. Secondly, as opposed to like when we implement a resilience policy, this sends a signal to countries where it's like, are they going to go through a hardship? Do we need to stop trading with them because we might be at risk because of all of these things? Like whether that's intentional or not, that is likely to happen. Thirdly, as Tyler told you, like free trade agreements are wonderful. We get those more under our side of the house because our goods become in more demand. Free trade agreements are really good because that reduces tariffs. Nobody likes tariffs. Fourthly, this improves our diplomatic relations uniquely because we're more likely to interact with each other because there's such a positive economic relationship to begin with. Fifthly, we think that what happens here is when your economy gets tough, these other countries see you struggling. They might come in to help you because they know what a wonderful trading partner you are. That's a unique benefit that sits under our side of the house. Well, outcomes of this, firstly, we prove just like get better diplomatic relations and aid. And the impacts of this is really important because like we have a new avenue as to able to prove as to like have support in our economy. So then find the idea like on the impacts of people and like countries, because economics is because this debate isn't about the economy, it's about who we help the most. Currently in New Zealand, like people are absolutely struggling. Everything is super expensive. By increasing efficiency and creating more competition, for example, if we introduce a new supermarket chain internationally, like if Aldi from Australia comes in, that means that we have a new player in the supermarket chain. That means this competition between countries like destroys the duopoly that we have right now. That competition means lower prices, and we think if this happens in industries across New Zealand, that means we can get lower prices overall. They don't have that because they like keep a resilience policy where they only invest in local industries. That means they can't prove that they get lower prices under their side of the house. We do. We help them. We help the most people. We are able to ensure that people pay less. But also I want to note that when our economy increases, as we told you under our side of the house, that means if we face economic hardships, we have all of these like reserves in terms of money to actually help people and get subsidies done when like economic hardships happen. That mitigates a lot of the material that they gave on like resilience. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for what was a fine speech, and I invite the third speaker of side Affirmative to come up and continue their next speech.
I find it pretty interesting that the chief example that this side of the house has used is like the dairy industry, the industry that we funnel huge amounts of subsidies into to grow that industry. The company Fonterra that we give huge amounts of like tax breaks to, inherently the industry that we use resilient policy on, funneling money into domestic industries to give a resilient domestic industry because we don't have this natural incredible comparative advantage they've tried to tell you that we have, so we have to do that. And I think that points out a lot of things in their case, that fundamentally the benefits that they have only operate if you're in a country like China or the US, which has incredible economies of scale existing, which has already got these really great industries, and which has brilliant comparative advantage because they're massive and have 300 million people to work the factories. That is not something that we have here, and so we have to work with what we've got, and we have to prioritize ourselves as a small country. So I've got broadly 2 points of clash here. We've got like Diplo and we've got prices. But before I get into that, I'm just going to point out an accusation of contradiction or inconsistency. So we've been told that basically, at first we said that we are, going to funnel money into industries domestically to like basically benefit them. And then at second, we said that we don't have comparative advantage. Yeah, the reason that we need to funnel the money in is because we don't have comparative advantage. The idea of comparative advantage and like letting the economy do its thing only works if our industries have the capacity to thrive without government intervention, if our industries have the capacity to stand on the world stage and like actually be bought by other countries because they're cheap enough and work really well as industries without government intervention, without resilience policy. We're using resilience policy to then give our industries the step up that they need to genuinely produce what we need as a country, the step up that they need to like compete internationally and actually thrive as a country. So we don't see that as a contradiction, we see that as a mech. So let's look into like Diplo and prices. The Diplo point is a bit smaller, but we still think that it weighs pretty highly in this debate because our position on the world stage generally flows into like what people think of us, which flows into what trade deals they'd like to make with us, if at all, which flows into like tourism. We generally think that people's opinion of us is extremely important. And the reason that we get a seat at the world stage as a country is really not because we do that much. It's because people like us and they think that we're cool. It's because we gave women the right to vote. It's because we're seen as a country that like stands up for what we believe in. Even though we've only got 5 million people, we fight for what we think is right. Bowing at the feet of China is inherently in contradiction with that. Bowing at the feet of our international trading partners who we rely on is inherently in contradiction with our positive international image. So what we've told you is that when we cut reliance with these people, when we're no longer inherently reliant on these international countries, what does this do? This like de-paralyzes us because we're no longer reliant on both the US and China, meaning that we can't take a stance on anything. It means that we're actually allowed to make the stance that we want to make, the stance that our people think is important. We're no longer in a position where we point out the Uyghur genocide and then get a call from China saying, hey bro, I wouldn't do that, and then we can't do it. We're actually able to point out what our people think are important. We have domestic and we have international benefits to this. Domestically, our people have more confidence in the government. That's incredibly important. Nobody wants a weak-willed government who can't fight for what their people believe. But like more importantly, on the world stage, they've told us that they're going to get massive Diplo benefits because they're going to have people wanting to invest in this country, and that now that we have essentially international countries with companies invested here, we're going to see benefits because people like the country that they are monetarily invested in. I think the thing that people don't like is the weak-willed country which can't fight for what they believe in, which is incredibly important for New Zealand. And I think that we can very clearly win that point because we're actually sticking to the principles that people like us for. Because when we try to pretend to be the big international player that we're not, it hurts us. So now, let's look into prices. But before I get into prices, yeah, I'll take a while.
I gave you material as to why New Zealand is more at risk to natural disasters and the industries themselves are even more at risk. How does your material interact?
Yeah, so this comes under prices. We think that broadly New Zealand is potentially more at risk to natural disasters, but using our resilience policy, we have like grain silos filled with all of the stuff that we use. The whole point, a third of the point of that policy is that we are actually able to be resilient to these issues, so that even though we're producing domestically, we have stockpiles so that when something goes horrifically wrong, we're able to work around it. Okay, a quick clarification I'd like to make is that throughout this, essentially, we believe that production provides a hell of a lot more jobs than buying stuff. And we are the side that is inherently benefiting production, that is trying to get our domestic industries producing more and selling more. That provides huge amounts of jobs, because the broad things that we seem to be valuing in this price point is like who creates more jobs and then who increases prices. We believe that we win on like both of these points, and then at increasing prices we also win where even if we're both increasing prices by the same amount for different reasons, we're increasing them in a better way because we're more able to accurately deal with them. So what we've told you on like producing jobs, fundamentally, we are investing money into domestic industries, and we're creating a whole bunch of jobs because new industries are coming in here, only works if we can become really great producers in these, if we can become world leaders, because otherwise everyone just goes and works in China. And they're going to work in China because they're a better industry, which is a bigger industry, which can pay more. For us, we're not going to be able to do that because we can't compete on the world stage without government intervention, which is what I was talking about there. And so we're actually going to provide more jobs because we're proving that we're giving our industries the leg up that they need. And so we provide bigger boost to the industries, so we provide more jobs. And broadly, even if we're getting costs increasing on both sides of the house, we have one side where costs are increasing, and you have a job while that's happening. Then we have the other side where A, costs are increasing in a manner which you haven't expected because it's a random supply side shock. You're losing your job because of this supply side shock, because now you work in, say, the oil industry, and now we can't buy any oil anymore because of these supply side shocks. And so you're not only losing your job and having prices increase, but like we know that potentially as we're developing our industries, they might be a bit more expensive. And because we can do that, we told you right from first that our government has the ability to prepare for this. They have the ability to like put money into the benefit. So A, people won't be losing their job, so they're not going to feel the hurt of prices as much. And B, we now have the ability to prepare for the hurt of prices. The government knows it's happening. They can plan around it. That is a very exclusive benefit to us, because there is no way that you believe that Chris Luxon is going to be able to predict a tsunami in Japan. That's just not happening, so they're not able to prepare. And so what do we see here? We see that we have significantly better outcomes for people when prices increase, because broadly, I don't think anyone is going to be able to argue that prices don't increase for different reasons on both sides of the house. We think that we're going to have potential short-term increases in prices as we develop our industries with that government boost, and then we see like thriving industry in New Zealand. But then we're able to deal with it as we go. You are not able to deal with it as we go. And so we think this provides intense weighting for the debate, because we as a country are going to benefit the most by long-term having a more resilient economy and having an economy that can like compete better on the world stage. Whereas on the comparative, we're ending up with a situation where even though we may, if we can get our industries to work very well, get more people working in those industries temporarily, there is then a supply side shock and they lose their jobs in that industry, and then we're back to square one. We are willing to eat a potential small harm, given that we're then going to open up our country to significantly better outcomes in the future. And then finally, a note on oil. We heard material at second that there are certain things which we simply have to buy. We would like to look into like alternatives. So maybe part of what we're doing is that we are a very windy and a very wet country. So part of what we're doing is we're looking into like developing our renewable industries with a boost up from the government so that we can move away from being reliant on these other economies, which is the exact same material that we've given you right from first. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for what was a fine speech, and I invite the third speaker of side negating to come up and continue their team's case today.
Side F's case is contingent that for some reason natural disasters only happen overseas. Clearly, sense check this is not true, which is why we think it's really important to be importing stuff and getting out and having an economy that is like active in many different areas and not reliant upon solely ourselves. Three things I'm going to be doing for you in this speech today. Firstly, I'm going to be addressing kind of like economic shock. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about like prices and the local economy, and finally diplomatic power and diplomatic relations. So firstly on economic shocks, which has been weighed really, really highly by F, as they've told you it's the most like important thing in this debate. The first and the main push we've heard from this is this idea of natural disasters, which are really harmful, as everything is stored in silos, and we're likely to be receiving things from only one nation. So then when like this nation gets hit by an earthquake, like bad things happen. So a few responses here. Firstly, we tell you that we're probably likely going to be forming relations with more than one nation because in the global economy, we already have multiple nations competing to produce like the best and the cheapest goods. I.e., we have like oil from Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, tech from South Korea and India. We think it's like beneficial for the New Zealand government because obviously they want to be like avoiding these shocks to look to invest in more than one of these nations. We tell you the way that we can do that is by like producing our own goods in response, which is how we both get something good. And secondly, New Zealand is not immune to natural disasters. We get them often, and we get them really, really badly. So why is this like better on our side of the house? We tell you that because we can like trade and build relations with multiple countries, when New Zealand is hit, we don't lose all of our essential goods because we're not reliant only upon ourselves. And we also tell you that on our side of the house, we're way more likely to receive like economic help from another country because they really rely on our dairy industry as well. Therefore, on our side of the house, when like these countries are much more likely to invest and help our economies get back up and running. On the comparative, on their side of the house, on their side of the house, what we are seeing is that New Zealand loses like all of our capacity in one go when we are like taken out by like Cyclone Gabrielle, for example. And other nations are not willing to help us, invest us. We're literally on our own when it comes to trying to get back on our feet because they're not invested and they don't have incentives to try and like improve our economy because they don't really care about us either. Note here on this particular thing about like building up reserves and like silos and stuff. Well, firstly, we tell you like what good is a grain silo when the hurricane comes through? Like this would still get destroyed, so we don't necessarily think that this has like the major like benefits they tell you. But secondly, we tell you we're able to get more reserves and we tell you that we're able to get them in more parts of the country when we're engaging with nations on many like levels and competing with them. This is when we're like actually able to import these goods at a higher level, making us like more resilient to these disasters because we actually have more of these. We're not just focused on developing themselves. So what does this mean? This means that we've proven in the economic shocks that they want to tell you matter most in this debate. We are the side that best is able to like deal with these and are able to like receive support from other nations as well. We think that based on their metrics, this is enough to win us the debate alone. So secondly then, on this, I'd just like to address this comparative advantage stuff quickly, that apparently New Zealand does not have a comparative advantage in the dairy industry. Firstly, note that we just tell you that like compared to some countries, for example, Oman, we have like a massive advantage insofar as we have like lots of easy land for agriculture and for farming. This is a comparative advantage compared to nations where they have like deserts, for example. We also tell you that like by developing this and making it more efficient, we are very much playing into our own side of the house by focusing on like this efficiency stuff and not worrying about things we can't do as well. So I think what we've established there is them trying to tell us that like our dairy is just like not on our side of the house is not really true. Okay, I'll take that.
If a natural disaster hit New Zealand and we were reliant on only agriculture exports, do you not think that would decimate our economy even more if we had nothing else to survive off of?
No, because we tell you that when we're like exporting this agriculture stuff, when other nations see that like our ag area gets wiped out, they're reliant upon us as well. This is when they look to invest and help us improve our own. Also, when New Zealand is hit, and that also means that like our other areas, such as I don't know, tech or something or dairy, are not affected because like we're not reliant upon producing them ourselves. They haven't been wiped out in the same way. So then on like the local economy and prices. Firstly, this idea about New Zealand with overseas goods. For some reason we've heard that like, just by investing in them, everyone's going to want to buy them and develop them. So why does this never happen? Because we tell you that other countries are going to be like more efficient at this when the other countries are practicing the idea of like this like efficient economy thing. This means that their goods, their tech or whatever, is produced cheaper and it's going to be produced better because they're like investing all of their stuff into this. Comparatively, on our side of the house, comparatively, New Zealand stuff, when we're trying to like invest in many areas, it's going to be more expensive and it's never going to be as good anyway. So even if we do produce this stuff, we're essentially wasting money because no one in New Zealand is going to buy it because it's like far inferior to like that which is being produced by other nations, and no one overseas is going to buy it because again, it's far inferior. So what we've heard is that we're essentially investing money into areas where no one's going to want to buy it anyways. So we're still going to be reliant on other nations. We tell you, people are still going to prefer this like technology of other nations. This means we think it's far more important to focus on getting this stuff into the country at cheaper prices if people are going to be buying it anyway, because we cannot possibly compete. And then secondly,
we've had this idea of competition, which we feel like has not received enough like response from Neg. We told you multiple times that simply by like opening up New Zealand's economy to like international actors, for example, introducing another supermarket, into like the economy, we can break duopolies and monopolies and, therefore lower prices. Why is this so very important in today's debate? Because note that ultimately consumers care the most about having low prices. This is a specific way that has been proven to work in which we can look to lower prices. We tell you this is going to make consumers, it's the only thing we get out of today's debate is that we can break the supermarket duopoly. We tell you this will definitely lower prices. This will make consumers very, very happy because now every time they go to the supermarket, they're not spending like half their rent. And we think that this is like when we think this is something that is so important, it could win us the debate. And then on employment, we've heard this idea that for some reason unemployment is just going to increase. So we've given you a few reasons why we don't think this is going to happen. Firstly, we tell you by like bringing in some more international like groups. This is where by bringing in some international groups, this is like when we can introduce some more job opportunities, more employers. This means that there's like competition between the different employers to try and attract workers, and this is when like more people get employed overall. But secondly, we also think that not when New Zealand's just producing stuff for like staying in New Zealand and being like kept in New Zealand, we think that ultimately the New Zealand market isn't as big as the one overseas. So therefore, like there's less jobs when we're only producing stuff for New Zealand. When we need to produce items in bigger quantities to go overseas, that is when we need like more manufacturing power, and that is when we employ more people. So we've clearly proved that we get lower prices, we get better employment, and people are not going to be buying our goods anyway, even if they're in New Zealand. Briefly then on economic stuff, we've heard why do people on diplomatic stuff, why do people like to be involved with New Zealand? We've heard that apparently the only idea is because they gave women the vote. No, we don't think so. Why would China be voting with it? Why would China be trading with us in the first place? They clearly don't care about things like that. Clearly they're trading with us for some reason, and we think that reason is because we have goods to offer. We tell you that those goods, even if we can't produce them at the same level, are better in other ways. The countries still want to be involved with us. No, this is really important because it increases our call-out power at the point in which we have something that China wants. This is when we are able to actually have an impact on their decisions and their economy. So at the end of this debate, better economic power, better for the local economy, and better reaction to economic shocks. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for what we define speech. Now, as is customary, we will reverse the speaking order and cut speech times in half. So I invite now the leader of side negating to close their team's case.
At the point where we're able to prove that we ensure that prices for New Zealanders and the everyday Kiwi are able to reduce, at the point where we show where we're not grovelling at China's feet and that we are able to maintain independence, at the point where we're able to show we're more effectively able to deal with these economic shocks, we win this debate. 3 areas of clash in this then. Firstly, on prices and sort of the impacts of the people here. Why this is so important is because if we're able to prove that we're able to reduce the economic harm and impact on your everyday New Zealander, we're able to get them into jobs, we're able to make it so that their day-to-day prices are lower, that's really important. Secondly, on diplomatic power, sort of like why we're going to be able to maintain independence and why the only reason China trades with us is not because women have the right to vote. Thirdly then, on dealing with economic shocks. We think that in these times of climate crisis and when we have economic shocks, because we have active reserves and we're constantly selling things, which means that we're able to build the amount of money that we have, we're able to win on that as well. Firstly then, I just want to whip Nathan's split in the sense that Nathan gave you analysis which said that when we form strong economic relations and diplomatic relations, when they see us struggling, they want to help us They want to help and give us economic aid because they know we are good trading partners. Know that this was substantively unresponded to and still stands in the debate, and this is so important in the sense that when we talk about like dealing with economic shocks, we are able to deal with economic shocks because we have these trading relations that's been totally unresponded to, and it's not good enough at reply. Now then, on prices, we say that ultimately we reduce prices because we gave you analysis that this freeing up of the market, allowing like new players to enter into the market. This leads to more competition, which means that we're able to have lower prices. This was unresponded to. Notice that the impacting on the prices here is that people are literally struggling. We actually show you how we're able to reduce that struggle. In the sense that when we are able to reduce prices for the day-to-day New Zealander, because we're able to substantively mechanise to you, that we're able to lower the prices because there are more companies who are willing to come into New Zealand, who are willing to relate to us, we're able to reduce the day-to-day prices for New Zealanders. Ultimately, they cannot bring you that same benefit because they just want to hold all the grains in a silo. Now then, on diplomatic power. Look, we say this like a rather minor point in the sense that they told us, look, we're grovelling at China's feet and that we don't have all this economic power in the world and that we don't have, like, we're simply just not strong enough. We tell you, like, substantively that our dairy is really, really good and people love our great high quality goods. And that's why China likes to trade with us, because we have this, like, sort of say on a global scale with China, in the sense that they want to keep their economic ties with us because they like our goods. That means that we're able to have some form of call-out power. Ultimately, on their side of the house, what they have to concede is that they're less likely to actually get goods. That's far more important because we're able to keep our say on call-out, and on their side of the house are much less likely to deal with things like high prices and dealing with economic shocks. Now then, on like dealing with economic shocks, that we've heard substantively that by holding reserve, we've got more stuff to give people and to give out subsidies. And they also use like this example of how they're going to be more prepared in climate disasters. And like, yay, like, we've got grain silos and stuff. Ultimately, we told you substantively, like at Nathan and Esther, that these natural disaster events are just going to destroy your reserves and they're going to destroy your silos, and that people still need oil and gas. This means that like all of their material, like a lot of their material falls out in the sense that we're still dependent on the other nations which have a comparative advantage within their certain industry. We need to play to our strengths and ensure that we keep our industries as strong as they can, and play to our strengths and ensure that we can make sure that we have the best prices for New Zealanders, that we maintain our diplomatic power, and that when we are in times of economic shock, that we're able to keep people safe and ensure that climate disasters are able to be solved.
I think to speak for what was a fine speech, I now invite the leader of Side Affirmative to come up and close today's debate.
Let's grant negation that they get something of a more efficient market. Later I'm going to explain why they don't, but let's grant them for a moment that they do. They get a more efficient market. They slightly decrease prices for everyone in the country. That's stable. What then? This never responds to the fact that we explained to you when a supply shock happens, you are literally unable to access materials for a certain amount of time because your supplier is not going through them. This does not respond to the fact that it can take time to re-establish trade routes. This does not respond to the fact that the governments need to inefficiently invest when this happens. We think that that this also doesn't deal with the fact that all of the big industries that they're talking about coming into this country are the same as every other industry in this country. They need resources imported from other places. If they do not have the resilience we provide with stockpiles of oil and crucial manufacturing things, they will grind to the halt, same as everything else. So all of the harms of our economic shock material stand, even when they try and mitigate it by telling you that they can compensate for it with this better economy, which has more money to pump into fixing things, right? Moving on from this, we also don't think that they do get the development of this economy they're talking about, because this debate is probably never decided on whether or not New Zealand becomes a really efficient and powerful trading country, because we're actually really small and we don't have that many natural advantages. We brought you this down through the line. Developing them does not yield that much of a benefit. However, it is a very significant benefit when you are able to ensure a much less of a risk of significant unemployment when these industries fail, if you are able to prevent a significant collapse in prices and increase in prices when these supply shocks do hit. As a result of this, we think that it is we can win the debate just on that material alone. And this is also because they broadly haven't contested how likely we told you supply shocks are, right? We gave you 3 mechanisms that only ever engage with climate. First of all, we told you that climate change is generally making the risk of natural disasters greater, also things like earthquakes. Second of all, we explained to you why it is that wars are increasing, why there is more international diplomatic tension because of all the actions of specific actors like Russia and China. The result of this was that the diplomatic causes of supply shocks are far more likely, therefore we need to ensure for the supply shocks in the future. Next, they told us, foreign investors will want to maintain their investments, right? So they'll invest in our country. However, down the line and in a POI, we highlighted how when you have a more resilient economy, it is far more likely that you are able to redevelop those industries rather than having to rely on importing lots of things from overseas, right? Because the very purpose of developing in like factories which are able to manufacture like the technology which you use to create your farms is that you can now get that from within your country without having to go overseas. Moreover, we also explained how it is very likely that companies will want to invest in you when they see you as being stable. We think that it is sufficient analysis to mitigate any kind of... Finally, why is it so bad that these happen suddenly? Because the government cannot plan for them easily. We explained why this means they need to invest inefficiently in things like government spending on benefits which they wouldn't need to on our side, or second of all, why they need to approve aid packages, and finally, why it takes ages to re-establish these supply chains, because often there is one country like Saudi Arabia which is very good at producing these and the others are far less inefficient. Finally, we have a diplomatic independence point which explains how very clearly New Zealand is a country which has diplomatic power, not because we are a very powerful country, but because we are a country which is seen as being morally integral. This means that when we prove we are able to take moral stances on a world stage, we are able to broaden our diplomatic base, therefore making it so that we have a much more desirable standing globally. We think that if the first point is a wash, this is debate-winning material because it is far more significant than their diplomatic point, because New Zealand is not a significant trading country, because New Zealand's not.
Steve, I didn't hear. Oh. Okay, perfect. Thanks everyone for a great round. As you know, this is a silent round, so we were not